Oh, wow. Looks like I gave a lot of people quite the Milky Yankee Doodle reach around with my last video talking about this mode, and I gotta say, there's a lot of white quizzical substances all around. Skill issues aside, I levy critiques on the mode, which, as of this one, we are in Pincer Maneuver 2, and this one caters to our electro-beloveds, Calcaro. I mean Shangliao and Yinlin, as this mode will be stupidly easy if you have them, much like having Camellia for Pincer 1. My critiques I think are still valid, those being 1. This mode is predatory as it's meant to pretty bluntly nudge you to pull for characters, 2. The buffs are boring and also the dependent thing for your score, 3. They need to add in-menu team and gear changing, and 4. Add trial characters because it's more friendly towards non-geared and newer players. However, I'm making this to address one specific thing, and that's the idea that Pincer Maneuver is endgame. I ask you, is it though? Where is it that we are led to believe this is endgame? Is it because in the 1.4 trailer and their notes this is labeled as a recurring event? Now, if I'm being honest, I didn't actually know this was a recurring event, I just saw it as another combat event to do. But outside of re-looking at the notes and re-watching the 1.4 trailer going over the event section, there's nothing there that really indicates this is an endgame mode. Are we conflating the terms of recurring and endgame? By the way, before any accusations on my opposition are thrown my way, I'm not opposed to this mode since this is essentially Warzone at the last stage. It's just worse because of how they have structured the system. I mean, I literally made a video talking about how they should add Warzone and Pain Cage modes to Wuthering Waves. But since this is in beta as per the notes, I'm happy I, and now some others are talking about this, since it's how this will get better. But as I've sort of hinted at, no, I don't think this is endgame, at least not right now. The reasons for that is because when compared to the actual endgame modes, Pincer offers nothing of its supposed relative kin. Let's look at why we tend to call Tower and Holograms endgame modes. Tower is a permanent resetting challenge that is more so a DPS gear check, but in some other ways checks how well you know the mechanics of the game when placed up against a timer, tanky and relatively hard-hitting and aggressive targets. Crow has also shown us that they are wanting to add more to this mode, as with the addition of the harder floor which can be completed one time for an extra challenge, so there's room for additions. Holograms is similar too, as it also is a partial gear check, but more so focuses on your execution of game mechanics when facing modified and harder bosses with different movesets, with later difficulties adding on affixes making the encounter more intense. They are one-time things, but Kura has shown desire to add more as we go along. Also, the community uses holograms as the go-to showcase bosses, or litmus tests on how skilled you are, or whatever the fuck. They both launched this way, and we consider them endgame because of how they test our account's gear and our understanding, prowess, and patience when doing them. Contrast with what we have now with Pincer, we have essentially none of those things. Gear check doesn't necessarily matter since your damage is coming from the buffs, whether it's the Havoc Wave from Pincer 1 or the Electro Strikes from Pincer 2. They are the things killing and doing damage, not necessarily your units, as they are more so the conduits to activate the buff or the cherries on top which make the buff useful, like Shangliao using his ultimate to group up then burst everything down with both his Liberation Blast and potential activation of the Electro Strikes. It's not really a test of skill or reactions, as the enemies are not only non-aggressive overall, but according to many people, this was easy peasy. They did it free to play, no issue, no gear, no characters, level 1, hand tied behind their back with Lumi squishing their head between her camel toe. If that is the case, then does it really suit as something which is to be regarded as endgame here? Are we considering our endgame be chalked up to something you can do while complaining about creator drama on the side at the same time now? Last thing, is it really endgame if Kuro is purposefully trying to scale all units for inclusion of all people up when Tower nor Holograms do that as our current endgame modes of mid 1.4 2024? Again, from my understanding, Tower and Holograms are that because of the listed things before. Personal, account DPS power check, skill, and adaptation, along with being a permanent aspirational thing. Pincer acts as most of that essentially, and even seems to want the accessibility compared to tower or holograms, which is fine to me. But I think we all agree that endgame stuff has a bar of entry that you will eventually reach, which this mode not only doesn't have, but the bar that is there is one specific and skewed towards the gacha system. If this was supposed to be endgame, then there would be no trial or boost for accessibility, much like how holograms or tower don't do that allowance. I know some will point to the Illusive realm, but again, I'm not considering that endgame personally either. It functions as a fun character enhancement roguelite test sphere where Kuro and the community can play around with fun, inaccessible things that we can't do in the real open area. I'd say that the only thing that would constitute this as a potential runner for endgame would be that it comes back fairly often with new additions and the last modes and bosses being somewhat difficult, but mostly because by that point you can't really see shit because of the culmination of your pent-up anger being barreled down Scar's Fraxadussy.
You have call?
Scar would be freaky with it. Outside of that, it's not a place you go to test your account or yourself on what you have built. I mean, it doesn't even allow a full team. So that's my reasoning as to why I don't buy endgame as the response or justification as to why this event was the way that it was. This didn't come off as an endgame experience. It came off as a ploy to try and make some people have the itch to pull the character that make this mode significantly easier. Let me be clear though, this whole thing doesn't mean I oppose it eventually becoming endgame, or at least some way to test your limits of your account. I think it can, but in its current state I think it needs to do a few core changes. First, getting away and being skewed towards the premier characters first and foremost. I don't want this to be a snowballing issue. I want us to catch the slimy things now and call it out so this doesn't escalate further. Solve or address the roots to alleviate the symptoms we experience. Secondly, pick whether or not this wants to be endgame. I personally gear towards allowing at least trial characters, as what we have now are trials but worse as they are arguably weaker and less viable. It can't even fully benefit from one of the buffs that's a general damage increase, because if your attack is base 130 and it gives you a 30% buff, that doesn't really move the needle for this event in terms of character specific contribution in the damage department. Trials would solve starting player issues and the somewhat unapproachability towards this event. There's even a solution in just having the chosen buffs be good damage sub-ins for your team, if they for whatever reason want to keep the all unit level increase. For example, Pincer 2 on the second team, coordinated attacks are needed for this. Why not give a literal coordinated attack add-on buff, like how Illusive Realm gives Ink Spirits as a buff, so that even if you use a team which has little or no coordinated attackers, you still have an option to do this side decently well or at least meet a material threshold. I think if at most they address my first 2 points, we're already in a significantly better spot, and from then we can see if this pans out to be another source of endgame content. Let me know what you think though. Of course, I appreciate you. Thank you for letting me take your time. Like and sub. And be safe out there.